What if I told you that everything you learned in school about Australia's first humans is not just oversimplified, it is factually incorrect? That the timeline you were given, the image of simple, primitive wanderers who drifted onto a barren continent by accident some 10 or 20,000 years ago, crumbles to dust the moment you look at the actual evidence sitting in museum drawers and archaeological labs. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through 9 discoveries that together form a portrait of the earliest Australians that is so radically advanced, so shockingly ancient that by the time we reach the final piece of evidence, you will understand that the true story of humanity's longest continuous civilization has been right in front of us, systematically dismissed because it simply should not be possible. This is the epic of a people who were not only the first mariners, the first artists, and the first engineers, but the keepers of a knowledge system so profound that modern science is only now beginning to comprehend what was almost lost. The standard narrative drilled into us is comfortable. It places the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia, gives agriculture to the Fertile Crescent, and relegates Australia to a footnoted distant landmass populated late by a few hardy groups who never quite advanced beyond the Stone Age. That narrative is a lie, and it survives only because it flatters a Eurocentric view of progress. For decades, the accepted arrival date for humans in Australia hovered around 40,000 years ago. Maybe a little earlier, but always safely after the supposed exodus from Africa. Then the ground started speaking. Archaeological sites like Majidbe in the Northern Territory began yielding dates of 65,000 years, pushing the arrival back into a time when, according to every existing model, modern humans should not have been capable of crossing 90 kilometers of open ocean. That single date alone would be enough to overturn textbooks, but it is merely the outermost layer of a much deeper, much stranger truth. And that truth is what I'm about to show you, piece by piece. Starting with the least shocking and ending with something that will fundamentally alter how you think about human memory, time, and the very nature of civilization itself. We begin our countdown with discovery number 9, an immense network of channels and stone traps hidden beneath the wetlands of southwestern Victoria. The Gunditjmara people did not simply hunt and gather across this landscape, they engineered it. More than 6,000 years ago, possibly earlier, they excavated a complex system of canals, weirs, and holding ponds to farm eels on a scale that rivals modern aquaculture. The channels were lined with volcanic rock, deliberately placed to guide migrating eels into woven traps. And the settlement that supported this industry included dozens of permanent stone dwellings. When European colonists first arrived, they assumed these structures were natural formations or the work of a lost race, because the idea that the local Aboriginal people, whom they deemed primitive, could have constructed a permanent, engineered food production system was literally unthinkable to them. But the stones don't lie. The Boojbim cultural landscape is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it proves that the first Australians were not nomadic wanderers. They were settled, they modified their environment with sophisticated hydraulic engineering, and they built the oldest known stone houses in any pre-agricultural society on Earth. It is a staggering fact, yet it barely scratches the surface of what we are about to uncover. Discovery number 8 moves us from engineering to ritual and to the shores of a dry lakebed called Mungo in New South Wales. In 1968, archaeologist Jim Bowler was investigating the Lunette when he noticed something protruding from the sand, a fragment of a human jaw stained the color of rust. What followed became known as Mungo Lady and later Mungo Man. These were not simple burials. Mungo Lady's bones had been deliberately crushed before interment, then baked in a high-temperature fire, effectively cremated. The cremation was followed by a complex set of rituals involving ochre that was mined from a location hundreds of kilometers away and sprinkled over the remains. The process indicates a belief system, a concept of an afterlife, and a funerary tradition that required planning, symbolic thought, and communal effort. The date assigned to this cremation? 42,000 years. To put that in perspective, at the same moment that Mungo Lady's family was conducting what is still the oldest known cremation on the planet, Europe was a frozen wasteland populated by Neanderthals who had yet to practice any comparable ritual. The inhabitants of ancient Australia were already engaging in the full spectrum of human spiritual expression, mourning their dead, adorning them with sacred pigment, and honoring them with fire tens of thousands of years before similar practices emerged anywhere else. And yet this is still only the warm-up. Drop deeper and we hit discovery number 7, painted across rock faces in the Kimberley region. The Guion, or Bradshaw. Paintings are so delicate and complex that early European observers assumed they were a recent hoax. They depict human figures in elaborate ceremonial dress, tall headdresses, and tasseled belts that move with a sense of grace and movement that feels almost photographic. The pigments have fused with the rock at a molecular level, making direct carbon dating difficult. But a fossilized mud wasp nest built directly over one of the paintings yielded a minimum age of 17,000 years. 17,000 years ago, when northern Europe was still under a mile of ice and the first temples of Göbekli Tepe were still thousands of years in the future, artists in Australia were producing figurative masterpieces with intricate textile designs and multi-point perspective. Some of these figures carry what appear to be boomerangs, tassels, and woven bags, suggesting a material culture far richer than any textbook ever dared suggest. The paintings are not isolated. They stretch across thousands of square kilometers of escarpment, forming a continuous gallery that was likely once part of a vast ceremonial network. The implications are dizzying: a structured society with specialized roles, aesthetic schools, and an artistic canon that persisted across unimaginable stretches of time. But we are only just getting started. Up to this point, the timeline we've been operating within a few tens of thousands of years might still feel manageable. Now we leave that comfort behind forever. What I'm about to reveal in the second half of this video will take us beyond the reach of conventional history, into a realm so deep that the very shape of the continent was different. You've seen the evidence that Australia's first humans were engineers, ritualists, and artists. But the next 5 discoveries will confront you with something far more unsettling: the possibility that these people possessed a continuity of knowledge that no other civilization on Earth has ever achieved. A thread of memory stretching so far back that it captured the drowning of entire landscapes. If you close this video now, you'll walk away with the comfortable notion that the first Australians were simply clever survivors. If you stay, you will understand that they were, and are, the custodians of a living record of deep time that the rest of humanity has completely forgotten. This is the point where you decide whether you want to protect the world you thought you knew or lean into the evidence that shatters it. The 6th discovery takes us to the very edge of the continental shelf, to a time 65,000 years ago, when the Majedbe rock shelter was excavated by a team led by Chris Clarkson. The lowest layers surrendered not just a few flakes of stone, but an entire assemblage of advanced tool technology. Among them were ground-edge axes, the oldest ever found. Axes polished to a smooth, durable cutting edge. A technique not supposed to appear until the agricultural revolution in the Middle East. Yet here it was, isolated in time by a gulf of 30,000 years. In the same layer, the team found ochre crayons worn down to nubs, seed-grinding stones covered in starch residues, and pigments mixed with reflective mica, a glittering paint that would have shimmered under torchlight in ceremonies that occurred when Europe was still exclusively inhabited by another human species entirely. The sheer cognitive modernity is undeniable. These were not people groping towards civilization. They had arrived with a complete cultural toolkit, fully formed, as if they stepped off a vessel already carrying in their minds the knowledge of art, food processing, and symbolic behavior that would take other continents eons to develop independently. And that vessel brings us to the fifth discovery, one that is not an object you can hold, but a seascape that no longer exists. The voyage to Australia 65,000 years ago was the single greatest maritime migration in human prehistory. Even during the lowest sea levels, when vast amounts of water were locked up in ice sheets, the channel separating the exposed Sahul Shelf from the islands of Southeast Asia was never less than 90 kilometers wide. There was no land bridge. There was no accident. A population of perhaps 100 to 1,000 individuals deliberately constructed watercraft capable of carrying multiple people, loaded it with provisions including yams and other starchy plants whose residues we find in the very bottom of Majedbe, and sailed beyond the horizon toward a landmass they could not possibly have seen. To do this required an understanding of navigation, of prevailing winds and currents, of celestial markers. It required a language complex enough to plan and coordinate a multi-family voyage. It required a culture that had already spent generations living along a now-drowned coastline. A culture of sea people whose very existence we can only infer from the faint traces of occupation that now lie under 100 meters of water. The first Australians were not drifters. They were explorers in the truest sense, making a deliberate leap into the unknown. And they did it at a time when Homo sapiens was supposedly still confined to the African and Asian mainlands, barely beginning to think about art and symbolic thought. Discovery number 4 shifts from archaeology to genetics, and it delivers a reality check so stark that it has forced even the most conservative geneticists to rewrite their timelines. A groundbreaking study of Aboriginal mitochondrial DNA, published in Nature, revealed that the founding population split from other modern human groups more than 50,000 years ago, and that certain deep maternal lineages have been continuous in Australia ever since. In fact, one haplogroup found among Aboriginal men in the Western Desert traces back to the initial wave of settlement, showing no significant outside genetic input until the modern era. This makes Aboriginal Australians the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, a title often mistakenly assigned to the Chinese or Egyptian civilizations, which are mere infants by comparison. The genetic data also preserves a faint but detectable signal of an even earlier dispersal of anatomically modern humans, one that predates the main out-of-Africa event by tens of thousands of years. A ghost population that may have moved along the southern coast of Asia before disappearing, leaving only a trace in the Aboriginal genome. The implication is that the story of humanity's expansion is not a single exodus but a complex web of movements, and that Australia may preserve the genetic memory of the very first modern human explorers. And that idea of memory, of record-keeping across impossible timescales, sets up discovery number 3. In 2015, a study in the Journal of Archaeological Science confirmed something that Indigenous Australians had been asserting all along. Oral traditions among coastal groups accurately describe sea level rise events that occurred more than 10,000 years ago. Stories tell of islands that are now underwater, of peninsulas that were once connected, of landmarks that were flooded when the ice melted. The Fitzroy Island story, for example, recounts a time when the island was part of the mainland before the sea rose, a change that geologists know happened around 9,800 years ago. Port Phillip Bay oral histories narrate the flooding of a fertile plain where now there is open water, an event dated to roughly 10,000 years. These are not vague myths, they are precise, cross-referenced observations that have been passed down through at least 500 generations without the aid of writing. No other culture on Earth can demonstrate oral transmission of geographical information across such a temporal chasm. The first Australians were not just remembering. They were systematically encoding landscape data into story, into song, into a mnemonic system so robust that it outlasted empires, ice ages, and the very land itself. Discovery number 2 forces us to look even deeper into what those songlines might preserve. In the Gulf of Carpentaria, marine geologists have mapped a drowned archipelago that was dry land during the peak of the last ice age. One particular rise, now under 20 meters of water, corresponds exactly to a sacred site described in Yolngu songlines, a hill called Muangum, where the ancestral beings performed ceremonies. The songlines detail the shape of the hill, its location relative to other features, and even the type of stone found their details that match the submerged topography revealed by sonar. The hill was last above water more than 12,000 years ago. That means a precise geographical memory has been kept alive, intact, and accurate across a span of time that makes the pyramids look like yesterday's news. The realization crashes over you like a wave. Oral tradition, when maintained with rigorous cultural protocols, is not a game of telephone. It is a hard science, a method of data storage and retrieval that can outlast stone monuments. And yet this is still not the final, most unsettling piece of the puzzle. We arrive now at the threshold of the final revelation, the discovery that takes everything we have discussed, the engineering, the art, the genetics, the voyage, the oral history, and wraps it into a single, almost terrifying conclusion about the nature of time and human intelligence. What I'm about to describe is not just another artifact. It is a system of knowledge so vast and so ancient that it fundamentally redefines what a civilization can look like. It has no monuments you can photograph, no single epicenter you can visit. And yet it is arguably the greatest intellectual achievement of any pre-modern culture on the planet. Brace yourself. The number one piece of evidence that overturns everything you were taught about Australia's first humans is the songline network itself. Not a single songline, but the entire integrated grid that covers the continent, a map. A history, a legal code, and a philosophical treatise, all woven into mnemonic songs that follow precise paths across thousands of kilometers. Each song describes the landscape in the order of the dreaming ancestors' travels, encoding water sources, food locations, and navigational cues. The entire system functions as a distributed supercomputer, with different clan groups each holding a section of the song, connected at meeting points where the accuracy of the transmission is tested and maintained. To memorize a songline, an initiated person must learn not only the melody and words, but the specific choreographed movements, the rock art motifs, and the seasonal indicators that align with each segment. There is no equivalent. The Aboriginal songlines form a unified, continent-spanning knowledge architecture that has been updated and refined for potentially 65,000 years. It is a living library without walls, a cultural repository that contains the exact geographic coordinates of resources that no longer exist in the waking world, waterholes that are now desert, coastlines that are now seabed, forests that turn to savanna at the end of the last ice age. When you walk a songline, you are literally walking a data stream that connects the present to a world that modern geology can barely reconstruct. The first Australians were not the simple people of the textbook. They were cartographers, astronomers, diplomats, and judges operating within a network that covers an entire continental brain. The very act of colonization, the deliberate attempt to sever these lines, was not just a crime against a people, but a catastrophic severing of humanity's longest-running data stream. And this is where we must stop, suspended in a question that the songlines themselves seem to whisper if you listen closely enough. Because the routes described in the oldest cycles do not just map the continent as it was 12,000 years ago, they allude to lands that no geological reconstruction has yet confirmed, islands and shores that might have slipped beneath the waves much earlier. During the rapid melt of earlier interglacials, what stories were carried when the sea rose so fast that entire territories vanished in a single human lifetime? Could the songlines hold the memory of coastlines that existed over 60,000 years ago, just after that first monumental crossing? If the oldest layers of the songline network are accurate for the end of the last ice age, then the possibility that they also encode the shorelines of the first landfall, the very beaches where those first explorers landed, is not fantasy. It is a testable hypothesis that modern bathymetric surveys are only now beginning to investigate. The song lines are still singing, and if we have the humility to listen, they may yet reveal the final, deepest secret of the first Australians, not just how they lived, but where they first set foot on a continent that had no witness except the stars and the endless patient sea.